Welcome to today's SCA webinar with Bob Barbet on open hole logs. Before we start today's webinar, we'd like to ask you a few questions so we can learn more about the demographics of the audience. So I'm going to launch the first polling question. What's your primary discipline? So we're starting to get the votes in now. Looks like we've got quite a few geoscientists, a few petroleum engineers, few petrophysicists, and a couple of other, looks like. Still collecting votes. Okay, looks like most of you have voted, so I'll go ahead and close and share the results. We have 76% geoscience, 12% petroleum engineering, 8% petrophysics, and 4% other. So now let's go to our second polling question. How many years of full-time experience do you have in the upstream oil and gas industry? Looks like we've got a pretty good range of different experience levels, some in each category. Still collecting votes. Okay, most of you have voted, so I'll go ahead and close the poll, share the results. Looks like we have 42% in the 1 to 10 year range, followed by 35% in the over 30-year range. So it looks like kind of a bimodal distribution there. There's some in each category. So thanks for sharing that information. I'm gonna share my desktop. So before I introduce Bob, I'd like to remind the audience today that you are muted, and you can ask questions during the presentation using the Go to Webinar question feature. We'll follow the Q&A at the end of the presentation, and you will be anonymous. And let me go through a couple of slides here to introduce you. This webinar is on open hole logs with Bob Barbet. And Bob has quite a wide experience in petrophysics. He started his career with Schlumberger, and after 10 years has been consulting to companies all around the world. He's been a distinguished lecturer for SPE. He's has co-authored numerous papers on various petrophysical topics and has been responsible for a lot of the discoveries around the world. So Bob has a BS from the U.S. Naval Academy and an MBA from University of Florida. Bob's going to be teaching a class called The Practical Interpretation of Open Hole Logs. So this webinar will tell you a little bit more about that class. It's offered live online. This is a new half-day format we're offering this year during COVID-19. So you'll get it during the morning in North America time. It may be convenient for you to attend in other parts of the world as well. And it's remote, so you can join in from anywhere. October 19th through 21st and the 26th through 28th. Bob also offers another class for SCA called Refrac Candidate Selection, Execution, and Performance Evaluation. That is offered November 4th through 5th in Houston. And you can see the description there. You can attend either of these classes, or you can call us to arrange to have the class brought either virtually or in person to your own office. So be sure and contact us either by phone or by email to make arrangements for an in-house class, if that's what you prefer. And this is, of course, part of our series of webinars featuring SCA instructors. We have one tomorrow, in fact, coming up. Salim Shekhar will be talking about geopressure. And then in October, about a month away, we have Bill Krebs, and he'll be talking about biostratigraphy in Myanmar. So look to SCA for all your needs regarding consulting, direct hire, projects and studies, and of course, training. And so Bob, I'm going to give you the presenting rights and let you take it away.
All right, so let me get this going here. All right, everybody see it okay?
Not yet.
People can hear me.
Now we see it. Yes, it's good now.
Got it. Okay, let me pull my screen out of the way here. All right. Get this out of my way. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending. As Susan mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about the course coming up. We're going to try something new. We're going to be doing it online and involve 6 4-hour segments and starting the 19th and 21st. So all you got to have is a computer to attend. So at any rate, there's more details on that coming. Let's see if I can go forward here. Okay. What are we trying to do? You know, basically, we're looking for people that want a practical understanding of open hole log interpretation. And, you know, typically, if you don't work with open hole logs every day or you just want to know more about it, there's a lot of little tricks and, you know, little techniques and stuff to be aware of. And there's also a lot of stuff out there that you don't need to worry about. So I think that probably one of the main things about this course is, you know, what don't you need to worry about? And there's also a lot of stuff that's not, you know, some stuff is less scientific than others that comes along there. You know, it's different interpretation techniques. So hopefully we'll give you an honest appraisal of what we think works and what doesn't work. We've been having pretty good success with this. As I mentioned here in the end, it requires no prior knowledge of logs or log interpretation. We assume that you know nothing about logs, that you haven't had any courses, that, you know, that basically all this, we start with pretty much the basics. We don't get too much into the physics, too much into the theory. It's mainly practical, although we do cover enough theory to, you know, to underscore what we're trying to, you know, how these tools basically work. You got to have some idea how the physics work to make sense out of this, but we try not to get overkill on that as well. Okay. Again, maybe we're going to focus on open hole logs, not K-stall, but open hole logs. We don't really have a petrophysical package involved. I use PowerLog myself in my consulting work, but, you know, we're not really using that. One thing about the programs, if any kind of program, if we had a petrophysical analysis program, is that, you know, a lot of times it's hard. You type in inputs and you hit, you know, run, and it gives you an answer. Well, you know, a lot of times it doesn't really tell you how it got that answer. Where if you back up one to Excel, which again is about, you know, 2 or 3 steps backwards as far as functionality for log analysis, but what it does do with Excel is it gives you the equations, and basically you can see what goes into each calculation, where it comes from, what you have to, what inputs you have to have, and it's pretty quick. I mean, we do pretty much all our calculations with Excel. Also, we talk about, you know, the theory and practice of, you know, applied interpretation. You know, what not only just, you know, just how to get the numbers, but what do you do with them? And how do you know it's right? You know, the biggest problem I see in petrophysics is that anybody with a spreadsheet or calculator and a formula book can generate an output. You know, I mean, it's the numbers, you know, you've got certain things you need, like water resistivity, true resistivity, porosity, your cementation factors and things like that. All those go in there, but the big problem with a lot of log interpretations that we've seen where people have stumbled on these and gotten wrong answers out of it is not knowing what it's supposed to look like, you know, not knowing what the right answer is. So, you know, you really need to incorporate a lot of reality checks. Like if you're telling somebody that a zone is going to make water or oil and it's already been perforated, you know, you've got to check there. You can go in and make sure that you got it right. You know, I was working for some people when I was at the Bureau of Economic Geology that, you know, were telling one of our clients down in Venezuela that their wells were going to make all water, and I said, well, it's real nice, except it's already made 1 million barrels. So things like that, you got to be careful. But then the inputs were going in weren't being checked. You know, it's like you can put numbers into a spreadsheet and come up with an answer, but it's real important to get an idea whether that answer is right or not. So there's a lot of little cross checks you can do to try and make sure it's right. And also and one of the big thing we get feedback on, positive feedback, is what's good data and what's bad data. You know, what's a log supposed to look like? You know, I mean, if you've got, you know, washouts on your density, or, you know, you got a real bad hole and you're trying to make a porosity measurement out of that, a lot of times you just can't get there from there. And a lot of times resistivity tools can be funny. You know, you're on their own type of tool, induction tools and salt mud, ladder logs and fresh mud. But there's ways to get around that. And there's ways to check around that, and which we'll talk about coming up here. try to make it real. It's the, getting some kind of match with reality is really important, not only on just the inputs that go into it, but on the results that go out. It's got to make sense. It's all got to add up. We encourage a lot of discussion. We make sure, we get a lot of questions, which is great. In questions or opportunities. We've got a manual that we've gotten pretty good feedback on, and you can pretty much use it going forward to as an easy reference for different petrophysical techniques. And the spreadsheet's yours to take. We'll be able to do all the calculations covered in the course, and you can take it back to your office and work on it then. We've got a basic spreadsheet that calculates some of the day-to-day stuff. But then, organic shales is kind of hard to ignore it. Probably 80% of the activity out there is in organic shales. And the actual analysis of organic shales is a little beyond the scope of what we're trying to cover here. It's fairly complicated, but it's also fairly straightforward. But what we do provide here in this course is a good foundation for that course. This is a prerequisite for that course, or it should be a prerequisite for that course, unless you're doing a lot of work with petrophysics otherwise. But we try to get you enough information and show you how it works so you can do organic shale analysis, because there's a lot of issues there. That's a big problem right now, is a lot of people have different ideas on what works and what doesn't work. And, it's resulted in some issues from time to time. A bit of a background, Susan talked about it already. 81 Schlumberger, primarily focused on tying logs back into fracs and production. So what that forces you to do is, if you're predicting a well is going to do something, usually you have to be pretty close. So that's where I incorporate these reality checks quite a bit. When you start doing forward modeling, where you say, okay, this well log looks like this, and this particular shale is going to make 800,000 barrels of oil and whatever gas. You got to have your stuff lined up, and the proof in the pudding is when the well makes on trend to make that number. If you tell somebody the well is going to make a certain rate, and we do that a lot, and it's not not from your basic petrophysics primarily, but from once you've got a good tie with all your parameters and you've got everything nailed down, it works. Did a lot of work internationally at the Bureau of Economic Geology. Most of the work we did down there was Venezuela, Argentina. We did some in Australia, Europe. At Shell, I was the principal petrophysicist, which means I was the only one for a while. And we had some senior advisors there, but I was doing most of the work. The oil shale project in Colorado, and also the Grossmont project in Canada. And also was recognized by the SPE in 2018, primarily this Permian Basin section, Southwest North American region, which I was very honored to get. But at any rate, so we've got a pretty good background in a bunch of different areas: high perm, low perm, unconventionals, conventional. So, it's a pretty good experience base to be able to tell you what you need to know, and probably, as I mentioned earlier, what you don't need to know. What do you need to make open hole logs give you the maximum information that you want. Some of the other schools we've already mentioned there. It's a well performance course we didn't talk about, and then the organic shale class as well. And we already talked about the refrac class, and we did a short little webinar on the webinar/course on organic shale refracs. Again, we're not going to cover these. We'll give you the foundations for these, and actually, we're going to include in the class the spreadsheets that you need to do all these advanced calculations. We won't be working exercises in them, but we'll show you what's in there, and you can basically take them back. So if you've got people within your organization that want to use this, even if they didn't go to the class, feel free to use our routines. Maybe we'll get a school out of that to come in and show you how to do it, right? But we're going to encourage that. So we'll give you the foundations for attending these other courses as well. I'll tell you what you need to know, but again, we're not going to cover the detail that these cover. These are taking it to the next level. Some comments from former attendees. Of course, we only took the good ones, but the ones that were not positive, we've incorporated and made changes. Like we made the course shorter, and we left out some of the specialty tools and things like that. But these were the positive comments that we had. So overall, it's been pretty pleasant experience. We've enjoyed it a lot. Last several classes we've done have been really a lot of fun to work with. It's great working with the young kids coming out. Most of the classes have been relatively young, relatively 1 to 5 experience years. And it's just it's been really enjoyable working with the kids like that. But hopefully you'll find it positive as well. So how important is petrophysics and log analysis? And this was kind of interesting, and this is talking mostly organic shales, but it's all the same as far as the value of petrophysics. Is not knowing what your wells are going to make going in for any reason can be. It's always been expensive in the past. Back when I was in the field and in sales, $1 million well would be a big deal. And if you didn't get the right interpretation done on it, and they went in and perforated it and completed it, and it came in water instead of oil, and that was a mistake. Well, that's gone up. That the stakes have risen quite a bit now with the shales. You're talking $5 to $6 million in the Permian, 8 million in the Delaware, probably a little less than that now. But at any rate, if you don't drill the well in the best spot to start with in any reservoir, it could be a very expensive proposition, and take up to 4 more top producing wells to cover those sunk costs. So it's not just that well you're burdening with poor performance. It's you're going to be pulling the cash out of other wells that's coming in there. So that's why we push this pretty hard. We have the whole course on this again that covers petrophysics of organic shales, but the concepts we have there really apply as well. You want to make sure you get it right. Make sure you get your ducks lined up. And it's kind of scary sometimes, because a lot of times you don't have all the information, especially the most challenging project I've ever worked on is exploration, where you're in an area where, and we did one down in Latin America where we were doing these large areas of, reservoir that had not been completed yet and didn't have offset wells. When you're in the middle of a bunch of producing wells, it's one, you can look at the character on the logs and say, yeah, okay, it looks like that well. Sure, but if you're out in the middle of nowhere, it gets dicey. So you got to really draw on some good solid rules of thumb and good solid physics on that. And one of the things we'll talk about is in the terms of your water saturation interpretations. There's some shortcuts there you can take that are very, very useful, that were very popular in this class. But at any rate, that's the thing. Try to make sure you got your ducks lined up, because it can be quite an expensive venture. So learning outcomes, main lithologies, what rock type are you there? Are you in sandstone, limestone, dolomite? How much shale is in there? How much pore volume is in there, which is going to determine your reserves? How much hydrocarbon saturation do you have? What's your hydrocarbon volumes? And then how do you apply a systematic process to get all these inputs, to go ahead and calculate all these? There's a number of specialty logging tools out there we'll talk about. Most of them all promise to get world peace and total consciousness if you run them, but a lot of times they tend to exaggerate the benefits a little bit, having been coming from that side of the business. And ideally is, this course, and really the other courses we teach as well, we want you to become an educated consumer of open hole log data. We don't have enough time here, and really enough to make everybody an open hole logging expert, and don't think everybody really needs that. Now, you've got resources typically internally or consulting or, service companies that you can draw on, but you got to be on top of what they're doing. If somebody's going in and making a forecast of what a zone's going to make, you might want to ask, well, where did you get the water resistivity for that? Or, how did you know this was the right, coefficients to use in the water saturation equation? Or, how did you deal with this? Did you have any core data, things like that? And you might find that a lot of times that they don't have everything they need to do, and it increases the error bar on this. But a lot of times you might be the person that has to make a decision on that, whether it's good or bad, and you're relying pretty heavily on the petrophysicists to do that. So it's a good idea to have an idea of just how good the data is going in and what they can do with the data. Because if you have a limited set of logs and limited set of inputs on it that are measured, it does get to be there is some risk involved. You're not always going to know exactly what you're going to get. So trying to minimize that risk is what we're really going to talk about. So basic content of the course, what is open hole logging? What's involved? What goes on out in the field? What kind of equipment do you need? How the tools run? Usually in the middle of the night and usually all night. This is what we found. Logging tools don't work during the daytime, we found most of the time. Basic rock properties, mainly lithology, and is what we're looking at, because that can be really critical. to what kind of water saturations you're going to see in irreducible water saturations. What can the wellbore do? What kind of effects do you have on it? Again, that's quality control is important. Knowing you've got good data is important, and not all data is good. So you've got to make sure you know what's good and what's bad. I saw one project in Venezuela we worked on where a geophysicist was trying to play log analysis. He had a huge density washout down in the main zone and called it an amplitude. You did a synthetic seismic on it and called it a big amplitude anomaly. He wanted to draw. Says, no, that's really just bad data, guy. But it's things like that happen all the time. If you don't really understand what the logs are supposed to look like. All logs are going to, basically, when you have a full suite of logs, or your triple combo is what we typically run, which is your density, porosity, neutron porosity, gamma ray, and resistivity. Those curves typically will have a characteristic response in relationship with each other. You're not dealing in a vacuum. If you have a high gamma ray, you should have a high neutron. It's that usually that always follows. You have in a shaly sand environment, low resistivity is usually shaly or wet. Basically, it should make sense. Everything should fit. Again, we talk about quick look interpretation. We don't spend too much time on that. Historically, the quick looks have been nice to have, like apparent water resistivities and things like that. But by and large, if you've got the ability to do a quantitative interpretation, if you've got the right information, that's usually a lot better, especially if you're trying to make a judgment on a fairly expensive well completion. How do you run logs out there? What are some of the real world practicalities of interpretation? What's bitten people in the past? And a lot of the experience that we have is from not doing it right the first time. When you do this long enough, you see quite a bit. And we haven't always known what we're doing on these, because sometimes you get into situations where you don't have the information you need, and then you live and learn from there. So you know what you don't know, which is the most important thing, I think. Okay, it's a little bit of humor there. One thing was scary in my last class is about half the young kids didn't know who this guy was. Does everybody know W.C. Fields? His favorite expression was "never drink the water." Because he was quite a imbiber. But it's also good advice to log analysts. You typically water is typically not what you're looking for. Oil and gas is good. Oil is better than gas for now. And basically, one of the goals we have is you're supposed to be able to know what type of fluids are going to be produced and how much volume is going to be produced. One area we'll talk about a little bit, it's not in the manual per se, but it's an application now that you're going to see for petrophysics. It's going to be a growing field. And I actually did 2 major projects when I was at Shell that we did this, is CO2 sequestration. And in this case, this may not be true. You may want water zones are fine for that, because a lot of these plants are generating a lot of CO2, and they want to keep it in the ground instead of put it in the air. An ideal place to do that is in old wells. So, and we've done, let's say, several projects where we've done that, going in, and you're looking at basically not just what's going to come out, but how much space do you have in there, and where can you put the CO2? And I think that's going to be a growth industry coming up here, because that's carbon management is big on everybody's radar right now. So that's something we're going to talk about as well, but it's not in the actual manual. It's just something that we've added here, but it's a valid application for petrophysics, But any rate, you want oil, you probably don't want water, again, unless you're trying to make a disposal well out of it. This is a very important concept. It's probably one of the most popular. People talk about this concept as one of the most useful pieces of information that we walk away from. And it's bulk volume water irreducible. We spend a lot of time on this, and we constantly refer to this concept whenever we do interpretation. If your bulk volume water, or the volume of water in the rock, say if you've got basically 95% of your rock is rock and 5% is water, then that's your bulk volume water is the 5%. You have what's called an irreducible number, which is on the right there. Sandstones around 5%, very, very high perm sandstones around 4%, fine grained sandstones can be a little higher. The rest of them, limestones, globular dolomites, Organic's a little interesting, is actually your kerogen bulk volume irreducible 0, because it's oil wet. It doesn't have any, capillary forces holding the water to it. You average around 3% because typically you don't have all of your pay is not kerogen in an organic shale. It's a blend of the two. But there's some ground truths that you can take from this. Like, for instance, if you walk into an area where you don't know the RW and you don't know the other parameters, the cementation factor and saturation exponent for your water saturation, but you do know what the well made. If you know a zone's making no water at all and it's a sandstone, I can tell you the water saturation based on bulk volume water without even taking a resistivity measurement. That's a very useful measurement. It's also very useful as a quality control technique. If you know what the production is from a zone in an area, and you know what whatever that bulk volume water is, it should be this number on the right if it's not making any water. Now, if you're making a lot of water, that gets a little harder. You know then that you don't have irreducible conditions, and you can't really go by this number. But it shouldn't be any lower than this number as far as BBW. So basically, in a sandstone, if you've got 10% porosity, and you know it's not making any water, then I can tell you that's probably right around 50% water saturation. Now, we use that in the shales a lot. Marcellus project we did, actually, it's at irreducible throughout. They make no water. A lot of these organic shales don't make any water. Eagle Ford, for instance, also your Marcellus. And basically, you know that areas like that, the Eagle Ford project we're working on, we just did about a 100 well project in Eagle Ford. And we're finding out that, the resistivity tools there are affected by pyrite quite a bit. A lot of times you don't have really good resistivity data, but you do have good lithology data, and your organic pays in there around 3%. In fact, actually, it's one of the plots we're going to show you here. We know it's probably more like 2.5%, 2.4%. That's what that number should be on every case. So if you use the water saturation model and it tells you some number other than that, it's wrong. So it's a very powerful tool, and we use it to normalize the resistivity data in all reservoirs, particularly unconventionals. But it's one of the handiest techniques that we talk about quite a bit. We'll use this extensively for trying to determine what's going to come out of the ground, and also just what kind of volumes you have. If you've got low water cuts, you can actually use this as a water saturation measurement without measuring water saturation. Here's an example from Sprayberry in West Texas. It was part of my DL talk a while back. You've got 0 to 25% porosity scale on there, and you can see it's shaded in blue slightly above the 5%, which it should be sandstone. Okay, it's a sand. There's your perforated interval on the left there, the 8150 to 72 or so. Once you frack that zone, it typically makes very high oil cut, 180 oil or 200 oil, and very low water cut. Some water in there. You come up the hole into a zone that a lot of times the operators would frack into, and there's your case there. Look at your 5% line. So you make that particular zone, if you frack into that, or I actually had one operator perforated it, because typically in some parts of the Sprayberry trend, they perforate everything. They actually perforated this zone and the oil zone and made a bunch of water and very little oil. So it's a good example of what BBW does in a conventional reservoir. But if I know that I'm at irreducible on that bottom zone, though, and I don't have the information, I don't have the log information, I can tell you what the water saturation is. I know the porosity. So it's a fairly handy technique. This is the plot I'm talking about. Almost all organic shales have this, or you can look at, conventional reservoirs will have this. You can do the same thing. And bulk volume hydrocarbons basically is how much hydrocarbon is in the rock. I mean, is there any hydrocarbon showing up in that rock? And from the plot here, you can see down below 3% porosity, there's no hydrocarbon. So if irreducible water is what's bound by capillary forces, and you're in a zone that's going to make no water, then that 3% number is a good number for BVI. So if you have 6% porosity and 3% BVI, you got 50% water saturation. But this gives you also a pretty good pay cutoff, because if you're at irreducible saturation, basically you're not going to produce anything. If you have 3% bulk volume irreducible and 2% bulk volume water, you're not going to produce anything. There's no mobility. So it's you're not going to flow anything below 3%. So it's pretty handy plots. And again, this is not based on any log measurements. This is just straight core. You're looking at core porosity, and you're looking at the presence of hydrocarbons. And the actual BBH is not as important as just the presence of hydrocarbons or not. But once you have no hydrocarbons in that tells you you're in the irreducible water section. So one of several tools we're going to use to try and validate the inputs that we have going in. So log interpretation, we're talking about this, basically we're trying to take the log measurements, convert it into physical hydrocarbon volumes, try to determine oil's economic value. And this is really kind of why I got into it and why I like it so much. When I was growing up, back in the day, the James Bond came out and everybody was into detectives and secret agents and finding stuff. And then another big fascination was treasure hunting, and this got to combine my two childhood, fantasies into one deal. You're treasure hunting because you're actually looking for treasure out there, and it's, I've come across many places where you find something that people left behind, or you're in a new area, you're adding new reserves. It's exciting, it's kind of neat to be able to make a difference like that. But it's also similar to a detective. I mean, you a lot of times you're not given the complete information. Most of the time your detective shows you have some limited clues putting the case together. You don't always have all the answers up front. If you did, it wouldn't be much of a story, right? But it's the same thing there. You're trying to put clues to solve a case, and when you solve a case and you get it right, it's very satisfying. It's kind of a neat niche to get into. And you can take it, pretty far if you've got a lot of other information, production data, good core data, good knowledge of the reservoir. You can pretty much make predictions of what these wells are going to make, which is, very, very valuable, particularly in the organic shales. I mean, it's a $1 billion benefit in the organic shales, but it's quite a neat little venture to do this. But what logs can do, we talk about, pay versus non-pay, pretty basic. What's pay look like? What does non-pay look like? What's your reservoir rock look like? What kind of volume do you have in the reservoir? And that's also useful for your carbon sequestration issues as well. What's permeable? What's non-permeable? How do you know what porosity is? How do you know what kind of saturations there are? Your thickness of formations for mapping. A lot of times, geologists are going to be mapping the thickness. They're going to be mapping the water saturations. They'll be mapping the porosities. So it's good to know where those numbers are coming from. Lithology we talked about again. That's important. Water resistivity goes into it. Some of the other things, low resistivity pay detection. A lot of times you can have pay that's not real high resistivity. Typically, oil is high because oil and gas are high because it's resistive, and water is low because it's typically salt water. But it's possible to have minerals in there that lower the resistivity, or different formation parameters that lower the resistivity. So sometimes you have pay that doesn't look like pay, and we talk about that. And then also, just one of the big targets that we have on this, out of all this stuff above, is how much is in there. Because to really going forward, if you're going to go in and do a refrac, or you're going to go in and try to develop a field, the first thing you want to know is how much oil was there to begin with, and then how much oil has come out. If you've only recovered 5% of the oil out of a shale reservoir, you're going to be able to get almost 14% of that oil out of there. So that tells you that 10% of your original oil in place is still recoverable. That number is very good. So, I mean, that's the type of thing you're looking for. Are we going to get to that level? Probably not, but we'll lay the foundation to there where you'll know what's needed for that. And also hopefully have confidence in that and numbers, and people do these techniques, that you can come up with reasonably good numbers on these. You can't tell what size of the prize is and what you're going to get. What it can't do, and again, if you don't have local knowledge, if you don't have a good handle on all your parameters, a lot of times you can't get the volume of hydrocarbons. If you don't know what the wells are making to start with, as far as oil, water, gas, and you're not really familiar with the parameters, the RWs and things like that. Some of the stuff you may have to do some additional testing to additional questions. But it's also good to know going into a program, if you're expecting logs to do stuff like this, and it's not, that maybe that's a justification for recommending to your managers to, hey, I think we might want to get some core here. We might want to look at what the electrical properties are. We might want to try and see what's going on here with the porosity. And you can actually predict flow rates, although if you don't have you can predict the flow rate and the permeability on any well. However, it's just generally going to be not right unless you have some kind of calibration. But if you do calibrate it, if you do show that your numbers are right going in, if you do your homework on your porosity, your water saturation, and tie your permeability and your water cut as well, you can predict it pretty well. But again, it's going to require measurements. You can't do it without any external information. You're going to need to know some flow rates in order to get permeability. You're going to need to know water cuts to try and make sure all your other parameters are right. But once you get that, it's pretty powerful what you can do with this. Some of the applications in the field, you can go from one well to the other. It's really good. Be able to map the parameters on a bench by bench basis. Look at wells, areas in between existing data points, which is good. A lot of that. A lot of times, especially in these shales, the Eagle Ford project I'm working on, I'm lucky to have a well 2 miles away from each other. We've got wells spotted every 2 or 3 miles all the way up and down the trend, but the rocks change quite a bit in between, so you've got to really have some kind of basis for filling that in. That's what we talk about that here in the course. The various maps there we talk about, pretty much those are standard: net pay, porosity, hydrocarbon saturations, gas in place, oil in place. Other thing we did, we've done quite a bit of, you can actually see faults sometimes. We down in Venezuela, we did a project where we used the apparent water resistivity within the water zones to find fault blocks. But you can also find them off the various log traces. We'll talk a little bit about that. And field studies, this provides, the logs typically provide the basis for field studies to try and, get more and more information out of your reservoir. So it's got a lot of good applications. So basically, here's a cartoon of a typical reservoir: gas, oil, and water. Your open hole log data should be able to tell you where you are in those columns. If you're in the gas column or oil column, you should be able to tell that. And you should be able to tell whether you're gas or whether you're oil. If you're in the water column, again, we've got fairly thick black lines here. Those are usually not that well defined unless you're in really, really high permeability rock. If you're in low permeability rock, you typically have a transition zone between the oil and water, and you need to know if you're in there. So it's this will allow you to find out just from the electrical measurements where you are within this column. So again, course, we're going to start delivering it online October 19th, 8 o'clock. We're going to have 4-hour segments each day, 3 days each week. Microsoft Excel, Adobe Reader, and I didn't update the register there, but Susan's going to go over that at the end here. And a quality internet connection, which I think is kind of a given. You want to make sure you've got good connection on the internet. And with that, I'll open it to questions.
Great, thanks, Bob. So I want to remind everyone you can use the question feature and go to webinar to type your questions. You're muted, so you can't ask them out loud. And after attending the webinar today, you will receive a link to a recording of the webinar, an evaluation form, and also a link for the class that Bob was discussing, the practical interpretation of open hole logs, that's offered in our new live online format during the mornings of October 19th through 21st and the 26th through 28th. So in addition to that class, Bob also teaches additional classes for SEA that he's mentioned: evaluating well performance for unconventional and conventional reservoirs, predicting organic shale well performance, refrac candidate selection, execution, and performance evaluation for conventional and unconventional reservoirs. So you have a plethora of courses to select from. Bob, talk a little bit more about the usefulness of open hole logs in carbon capture and storage. You mentioned briefly the use of them for a CO2 sequestration project.
Yeah, it's a very, very, very timely issue right now. Basically, if you've got an old depleted reservoir that's, the pressure's drawn down and you've recovered most of the hydrocarbons, that whatever that storage space was that you pulled out, you should be able to put stuff back in again. And we've done a lot of work with this. We had a big, the Shell project was the biggest one we did in the Rockies, where they were trying to find a disposal system for the power plant we were going to run out of the oil shale up there. We were looking to put something like 90 million cubic feet a day of H2S and bad stuff and CO2 down in the ground, and finally found some stuff in the Entrada sandstone. I think we ended up going into their high permeability sandstone. We've done some work out in the Bay Area out by San Francisco. We looked at some of the older reservoirs down there for some of the East Bay facilities. Some of the plants were trying to find places to sequester CO2. But basically, all you need in a reservoir side is a conventional reservoir with storage space in it, which you're measuring with porosity. You're measuring your water saturation, so how much space you have in there. But yeah, it's you're using the same techniques that we're using here. Everything we're going to talk about here for oil and gas detection, we can also use for the carbon sequestration analysis.
Great. Talk a little bit about the value of information calculations. You mentioned in some cases you may choose to add core to your evaluation program. So how would you be able to justify that additional expenditure?
Exactly. Good question, because I think it's really important to know what you know and know what you don't know. And if what you don't know is going to hurt you, you might want to know more. So I mean, it's important to know, certain things are presented in petrophysics and log analysis as truisms like this is always X. Well, okay, well, we had one class one time where the guy in the back says, I don't want to know the rule of thumb. I want to know the 5%. I want to know, I don't want to care. I don't want to know the 80%. I want to know the 5%. After about an hour of giving them the 5%, I says, no, please just don't tell me that. Just tell me the 80%. Please. I don't want to know the 5%. There's always little nuances. For every rule, there's always an exception in most of this stuff. But I mean, if it's something that's important enough, like if you're making a major decision off of a well and you have a limited data set, it's important to know what you don't know and what you need to do to know that. Are there tools available out there you can run that can get you the information, or do you need to look at core or more production data, more test analysis, things like that. So, and hopefully we'll get people to the comfort level there where they know what you can depend on, what you can count on, and what you need to be careful with.
That's probably a key point. What decisions will be made based on the information you're gathering? Will it change the decision?
Exactly. Yes.
So the next question is with respect to unconventional wells, what would be the basic log suite that you would set up for interpretation in the unconventional reservoirs?
We've looked at probably almost 2,000 so far between the Permian and Eagle Ford, and by and large, you can't really have much less than a triple combo, which is your resistivity, density, porosity, neutron porosity, gamma ray. Those are the suites that we use to crank the numbers out. Now, the actual calibration of that, there's some specialty tools to look for. We typically like to see some kind of a clay volume indicator, ECS type tool or GEM, or there's various pulse neutron tools. We like to see one of those early on. X-ray diffraction is good to have in core, but we like the log numbers better because it's a lot better resolution match. But things like that, actual core porosity, because your log porosity is going to be, and unconventional is going to be a function of your pore space and your kerogen, and kerogen doesn't flow. Kerogen is a solid, but it's going to look like porosity. It's got high resistivity and it's got high porosity, so you have to account for that. But we do that with core data, and but once you get that on the first well or two, you can basically use triple combos on every well, at least in the organic shales we've worked in so far.
So how frequently are they capturing core on these big shale well projects?
We haven't found one yet where you don't have it. I mean, it's some areas are better than others, but a lot of the big research consortiums come in, and most of the operators bought into these, so early on they got a handle on these in the organic shales anyway. So it's fairly well known what the data is early on. But yeah, and once you get the model set up, and once you can go and show people that you can predict performance on these wells, which we do pretty much every day, then the need to go get new measurements and calibrations is kind of minimized. And once you got a model that's giving you good results, which we have pretty much in Eagle Ford and the Permian primarily. Well, we've done a lot of work all over Niobrara, Woodford, but pretty much everywhere we've gone, we've gotten pretty good models to work with, so we don't really need that much additional data once you've worked an area and had some calibrations. But going into an area for the first time is sometimes exciting. You pull a lot of SP papers out and look for core data, digitize logs and papers and stuff if you don't have the data. So you can typically get a pretty good model at some point on these.
So what are the big differences between using open hole logs in conventional reservoirs versus unconventional reservoirs?
Pretty much just the kerogen, the presence of kerogen is the big thing, and then your need to normalized resistivity is probably more important in the unconventional, because you've got typically such a high H on these wells, where just small changes in water saturation can give you large changes in your volumetrics. But being able to account for the kerogen is really the thing. Calculating clay volume, which you just also done in conventional reservoirs, but the kerogen is what really you've got to be able to account for. And core data handles that just fine. So, but you have to have core data for that.
So in the more than 2 decades that you've been working in open hole logs and consulting, how have you seen the best practices evolve, particularly with respect to unconventional reservoirs?
Good question. I mean, they've become a lot more automated, they're a lot more complicated. I mean, you look at some of the logs when we were running back in the 80s, you know, you look at we might have had maybe half a dozen parameters we'd type in, and, you know, maybe a dozen on more complicated tools. And now it's, you know, you've got 8 and 10 pages of numbers that go into all these numbers, and the quality control has gotten a lot better. You still need to normalize. I mean, having a new log from it doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to have issues, but by and large, after about 1985 or 86, you got your delta as far as the error bar between the various service companies got pretty small. Back when we first started doing this in the early 80s, there was a huge difference. Schlumberger and Gerhardt were really the only companies that could run decent logs. But, you know, with time, Baker caught up with them, and Halliburton caught up with them. So, you know, by the mid 80s, and the mom and pops as well, mid to late 80s, your quality control was pretty much good throughout the industry. But you still have to be able to, you can still have bad logs, but it just, like certain vendors back in the 70s were just bad all the time. You know, you knew their data was not going to be any good, but that kind of went away. But and we've got a lot of new measurements, although, you know, it's by and large, the basic ones are still pretty much the ones we use day in and day out. Most of the new measurements are used to, you know, enhance the interpretation of the basic ones. But other than that, yeah, it's good.
So what tools do you recommend for acquiring shear wave sonic data?
Typically, the Schlumberger dipole sonic imager is good. Not dipoles, the sonic scanner. We like their sonic scanner. We like the Baker XMAC tool, the Halliburton tool. I haven't done too much with, but typically the newer multi-array tend to work a little bit better. All of them have issues. It's probably one of the biggest misunderstandings in the industry, is that every single dipole sonic is going to have bad data, because none of them are borehole compensated. So you've got issues with washouts, you've got issues with velocity differences between layers, and you have to be able to pull the good data and the bad data. So we tell people this, and they kind of look at it as kind of funny, is, well, if I have a rock properties log that I've empirically tied back to the dipole, which we do, we'll show you how we do that. Basically, I use the empirical data to design a frac. I don't use the actual measured data, because the measured data has errors in it. And you've taken those errors out with the correlation. You know, you've taken out the bed boundary effects. You've taken out the, you know, various effects that, you know, the basically rugosity and things like that. And the tools have flags on them that show what's good and bad, which is useful. But you have to typically ask for those. But yeah, that's a good question, because that's an area that does get misused quite a bit. People look at it as gospel, and service companies don't like to advertise that their data is bad. But it's physically impossible to have 100% data quality from top to bottom. The best I've seen is maybe 85 or 90 at the most, and that's in a perfect gun barrel hole with just going from a sand to a shale. You're going to get a skip. So I mean, which is not real. So I mean, you're going from, you know, 50 microseconds to 80 microseconds, and half the tool is in 80 and half the tool is in 50. It's confused. It doesn't know what to do. So I mean, it's you got a bad data point there, which you need to weed out. So but we talk about that.
So what are some of the big challenges still out there in open hole logs? What's the holy grail for open hole logs?
Good question. Good question. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say what's coming. You know, there's been some interesting movements. The electromagnetic tools are coming back, and those have potential. I've seen some issues with those coming out. So I'm not really completely sold on them yet, but nuclear magnetic resonance has got some interesting stuff going on. There's a lot of specialty tools that have got, you know, information coming out that can be useful. Do you need it on every single well? No, not all the time, but, you know, there's always, the low resistivity pay has always been a monster out there that we have to deal with, you know, being able to find that. I think the electromagnetic propagation tools are going to be useful for those that are coming out. But Yeah, by and large, I think you're getting some incremental changes. Now, I'm not sure what the R&D budgets are, going forward. This is probably an area where, you know, people are not going to be putting much money into it, because one of the problems we've had in open hole logging is back before the shales came up, open hole logging districts were everywhere. I mean, people were running logs all the time. I mean, we were running probably 90% of the wells out there had open hole logs run on them. Well, I think now with the shales, 90% of the wells out there have no open hole logs. So, I mean, you've gone from, most of your wells being conventional and needing logs to most of your wells being unconventional. And you might run a pilot log or use an offset legacy well. But, and some operators will log the laterals. We talk about that, the benefits and disadvantages of that. We talk about that quite a bit. You actually get data in the lateral. But that's been a major change. I mean, I think there's like one Schlumberger district in West Texas. When I was working out there, there was probably 7 or 8. Every little town had a logging district. But now, with the shales and the low activity with open hole logs, it's that has dropped off quite a bit for all the vendors.
So I guess that begs the question, how will the skills that you learn in learning how to analyze open hole logs, how are those transferable during the energy transition?
Transferable
to other forms of energy, the energy transition.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think the carbon captured issue is important. I think that's being able to deal with that. We've got some solutions there that help people. I think minimizing, one thing that is important when prices do get down in the low range where they are now, that you want to get it right. When oil's $100 a barrel, you make a mistake on a well, it doesn't ding you as bad as if it's $40 a barrel. So it's the margin of error is going to be decreased as you have tighter and tighter margins on these things. So it's more important than ever to try and get things right on these, to do your homework. I think it's one of the things we show, and one of the cartoons we show is Abe Lincoln's, to give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'm going to spend 4 hours sharpening my axe. Make sure you get all your stuff lined up ahead of time, and then instead of floundering around. But
That's great.
But yeah,
I think it does come back to the value of information. That's for
yeah,
sure.
sure.
So I think that's it for the questions we've received today. So I want to remind our listeners that you'll receive a link to a recording of today's webinar. You'll get an evaluation form and a link to register for practical interpretation of open hole logs. That's offered in live online format during the mornings of October 19th through 21st, 26th through 28th in North America time in the mornings. And Bob also teaches a number of other classes, so be sure to look at our website to see which classes is the best fit for you and when they're offered. Thanks for joining us today. Goodbye, everybody.